La siguiente sesión, Estonia, país digital, será en inglés. Invitamos al escenario a Thomas Ilves, expresidente de Estonia, y como conductor de sesión a Juan José Garrido, director del comercio.
Hola, hace 45 años que no he estudiado español y tal vez tengo que hablar en inglés, pero me agradezco mucho que en la sesión antes hay 3 directoras de digitalización que eran mujeres. Eso es increíble. Pero ahora voy a hablar en inglés porque es un poquito más fácil para mí y ustedes pueden entenderme mejor. Because my Spanish isn't that good. Anyway, I will talk about today how my little country digitized and is today really one of the leading countries in the world in digitization. And you can see here what we are. We're very small, yet 90% of the population uses internet regularly. 88% of the population has households, has a computer at home, and virtually everyone has an ID card. Okay, this may not be so special if you are a normal, well-developed country, but what is important to keep in mind is that until 1991, we were occupied by the Soviet Union, and we were very poor. In fact, well, I'll talk about that. I'm going to try to speak quickly here. But what is important to keep in mind before I get to what we did is that where we are today, we're a country with 1.3 million people. We have 4 unicorns. Probably the one you know best is Skype, which was invented in my country. We have basically 0.3% of the population is engaged in the IT sector that produces 7% of GDP. And we're very proud of how far we've come, obviously. And we are, according to the European Commission, because we're a member of the European Union, #1 in Europe for digitization of public services, of governance. But we're also #1, according to the UN, in Europe for IT or cybersecurity. But what makes me especially happy is the fact that we are also, well, we're #1 again, there it says #2, we're #2 in the world in internet freedom. The fact that we can do both cybersecurity very well and do internet freedom is something that is important to keep in mind when people say you have to give up internet freedom in order to have cybersecurity, or vice versa. In order to have internet freedom, you can't have cybersecurity. So, what I'm going to talk about today basically is that today technology has become so cheap you don't think about technology when you talk about the costs of digitization. What you really have to talk about is political will to digitize. If you have the political will, you then can create the legal basis, well, first the policy of what you want to do. And then, if you know what you want to do, you create the legal basis, and then based on the legislation that you have, then, in fact, you can then create the regulation. Peru, interestingly enough, actually is rather good on the legislative basis of one of the key elements of what you need, but where I think you need work is on the implementation or the using the legal basis that you already have. The 4 things you really need from our experience, and other people can do it differently, but what we have found through trial and error, and a lot of error, I have to admit, because we started 27 years ago, but today we more or less know what you need. You need to know, most important is you need a strong, secure digital identity. And it says legal efficacy, that means you can sign documents. You, in fact, have that law here in Peru, which is very good. Digital services are things that you need to develop that people want. Because usually what happens is the finance ministry says, oh good, let's computerize so we can get more money. Well, that's nice and that's good, but what you need to do if you want to have an effective digital society is you need to offer services that people like. What we also discovered is that it's not enough to have a strong digital identity. You need a secure architecture. What the architecture is, what it means, I will talk about, but the architecture that we developed has been either taken over directly by several countries in the region, Panama, and as Yolanda spoke here before, Mexico has taken the system we devised and has adapted it to its federal structure, which is, well, I mean, it depends on the kind of governance, so you have to adapt what we have. And finally, one final point that is not being stressed enough is you need to guarantee the integrity of data. What all of that means is the topic of my talk. The system we developed, first of all, we built it on existing standards using open source, non-proprietary software. This is important because many countries go and buy software, which then locks you into one company. You can't really change it. We instead, using basically Linux, we developed a system that now other countries, most notably Finland, our neighbor to the north, have now also adopted, and we together developed the software for our national systems. Very important is that we have, since the very beginning, had very strong private sector participation and investment in digitization. I would say that a primary driver of digitization in the government sector has been the private sector. NGOs are also important, I'll get to that. The infrastructure that we have, we basically set up in 2001. All digital services that we offer from then on are based on the infrastructure that we created then. We have obviously modernized it. We have far better, higher levels of encryption today, but nonetheless, the system is basically the same. And when new services come on, they all use this already existing infrastructure. And that means that especially the private sector can easily use the system that we already have for creating their own digital private sector standards. Now, people ask me, why did you do it? Briefly, our motivation was as follows. Estonia and Finland are cousins to the north. We speak kind of similar languages. It's kind of like Portuguese and Spanish. That's about how different they are. So you more or less can understand the other one. In 3 weeks of living in one place, you can speak the language. And we're very close, culturally, in general. In 1938, which was the last year before World War II, last full year before World War II, Estonia and Finland had the same GDP per capita. We're basically agrarian societies, low levels of urbanization, low levels of telephony. And then came World War II. In the process of World War II, we were invaded by and occupied by the Soviets. Then the Nazis invaded and occupied us, and then the Soviets came back. And so when we had our first full year of independence again, which was 1992, when we could measure statistics, our GDP per capita, nominal GDP per capita, was $2,832 US. The Finns, their nominal GDP that year, as you can see, was 22,300 something. The point is, you can see here the benefits of being part of the Soviet Union, right? So we were fairly poor, and what this means, what we realized is this is what Finland had, this is what we had, and only about 1/3 of the people in my country had even that, and if you wanted one of those, you had to wait 6 months to a year to get it. So the question is, what do you do? And all kinds of people had all kinds of ideas. Do we continue being Soviet with collectivized agriculture? Do we become Hong Kong and throw out all the rules? Do we do radical economic reforms? Which we did. We did privatization, property restitution, all that. But we knew that all of that takes time to have an effect. And even still, it didn't look very good because we knew that if you have 50 years of no development, it's going to take 50 years at least to catch up, and the other ones, sort of like Zeno's paradox, the turtle keeps moving. I mean, we're going to have to catch up to something that is already moving on. We knew reforms would take a long time, and our population was very poor. The only advantage that we had was we were well educated. So I was sitting there wondering, what are we going to do? And then in 1993, the first web browser came out. And this is one of the primary motivations of what we did. The first web browser came out. This was only 4 years after Tim Berners-Lee invented the hypertext transfer protocol, or HTTP, which you see on all of your websites. Mosaic was a web browser. At that time, you couldn't download it from the web. You had to go buy it, $29.95, and you would take the floppies and put it into your computer, and then you had a web browser. And there weren't many web pages to browse, but that was the key, is that everyone was starting on a level playing field when it came to the era of the web. And this was my little inspiration. It was like, well, here's one place where we can, in fact, do much more, or we can be as good as the big, rich, long-developed countries. The other thing that was important from my point of view, because it was my input, was that you want to get kids started early online. And that came from my own experience, because in 1969, which was basically 49 years ago, and I was 15 years old, I had a math teacher who did an experiment, one-off, only once, and that was to teach a small group of us how to program. And that stuck with me my entire life. We programmed in BASIC, and this was, sort of primitive language, but at the time it was pretty good. And later on in life, I programmed PDP-8 in assembler language. It stayed with me, and I thought, well, if I could do that, why don't we do this for a whole country? So we started, the first thing we did was got kids online. We started in 96. By 98, 99, all Estonian schools had computer labs. They were online, and from there on, things just kept going. We realized already in the late 90s that, of course, if we wanted to get anything done, it's not enough just to have the kids, but what you want all people to feel comfortable with computers. And so we had a program that was largely supported and promoted and pushed by the banks, together with the government and NGO enthusiasts who wanted to do digitization. We went around the country and taught people in rural areas how to use a computer. The banks wanted to do it because they didn't want to have brick and mortar bank offices in every little village. And we just wanted to get people understanding how to use the web. So that's where we were at the end of the 90s. At the end of the 90s, however, we realized we had to go further than that, because we needed something much stronger, much more robust. And so we sat around saying, well, what are the fundamental issues that we face? And the fundamental issue we face is actually, this is a cartoon from the American magazine, The New Yorker, from 1993. But this is the fundamental problem of the web. That is, you don't know who you're talking to. And this is the basis of most phishing attacks, most hacks. The hack of the US Democratic National Committee, the hack of the Office of Personnel Management, all these hacks, they all come from someone, you think someone is the right person, but it turns out to be someone else. And so we thought, what do we need to get around this fundamental issue? And what you really do need is a digital identity. In order to have a digital identity, it has to be secure. And it has to be unique. That means only you have that identity. No one else has it. It has to have legal efficacy, which again is a fancy way of saying you need to be able to sign legal documents. It must be equivalent to a signature on a check, a signature on a contract, wherever you need a signature and where you use a signature. And so that was the legal basis of it. Then, and up till today, you need two-factor authentication. That means it's not enough to have an email address and a password. That's only one factor. You need something else to say that you are you. In order for all that to work, you need also to have end-to-end encryption. From your device to whoever you're communicating with, or whatever office, everything from the device to the next device, to the other device at the other end, everything in between must be encrypted. And then a final thing which we realize, and is still a problem in much of Europe today, is that you really don't get things moving in the digital world unless most people have a digital identity. Why? Well, it's behavioral economics. In those countries in Europe where you can have a digital identity if you want, but you don't need one, the uptake rates or the adoption rates are about 15–20%. Now, if you're in the government or you're in the private sector, you'll say, well, that's nice, but 85% of the people don't have an identity. Why should I invest in developing a service that cannot be used by 85% of the population? Because the logic from the government side or from the corporate side is you want people to use it. So I'm going to invest if and only if I know that most people can use it. So the first step in what we did in 2000, we passed a digital signature law, which means a digital signature, something you sign online, is equivalent to a physical signature, which is the basis of everything that followed. And all legal digital transactions, as you can see here, contracts, applications, money transfers, prescriptions, tax returns, they're all based on a digital prescription. And this is the basis of why our e-governance system is as robust as it is. It is to the point today that in my country, there are 3 transactions between the citizen or resident and the state that you cannot do online. You cannot get married online. You have to show up. Well, that's a good idea. The other one is not so nice. If you want to get divorced, you both have to show up. And then finally, on transfers of property, which is that if you follow the news in, say, London or the United States these days, where you have anonymous shell companies buying property and which turn out to be owned by mafiosos from St. Petersburg, buying apartments in the home of the President of the United States, it's not a good idea, right? So, but you cannot do that in my country. You have to show up. You can't have a shell company where you don't know who owns it. So in 2001, we rolled out the digital identity card. It looks just like your identity card. They're all more or less the same. It's a card. They're always the same size. They have a chip on it. The next step, we said, well, if it's a chip, why don't we put it in a phone as well? Because after all, what is your SIM card, but if not just a chip? And so, in fact, at least in the country, you can go and get your SIM card upgraded to also offer all the digital services that you can access with your digital card. As I mentioned, end-to-end encryption. This is just kind of it's a picture of it. So whatever device you have, whatever leaves your device must be encrypted. And it must be encrypted all the way until it gets to where you want it to go. Two-factor authentication, which I mentioned, you need 2 things. You need something you have. In our case, it's a chip. if you don't have a chip, you can use something else. I mean, you can use a thumbprint, sort of digitally, or you can use your eye or a face. So far, we trust the chip most. And then there's something you know. We use numbers. We put in a number to identify ourselves. We put in another number to, in addition to the first number that we then use to legalize something, say bank transfer or contract. And so here is just a view of how you sign documents. And you want to sign a document, you take the document and then you attach just a stamp on it, a time stamp that says this is a legal document signed by you. And it turns out to be extremely useful. A year ago, I visited Uruguay and Paraguay, and Yolanda was there when I was in Uruguay, but then I flew to Paraguay and I got an email saying that I'd forgotten to sign a contract for a bank loan. So what did I do? I pulled out my card and my card reader and I got onto Wi-Fi and I pulled out the contract that I had forgotten to sign, and I signed it and I sent it off, and it got there just in time, so I got my loan, thank God. All right, now, it's not enough if you're going to organize a government to be able to just sign things. Things have to be connected. Something has to verify who you are to the Ministry of Social Affairs or to the police. And in fact, if the police want to check that, have you paid your parking tickets, they can do that without you, but they need to be able to identify you. And so what we had when we were thinking about how do we connect everything to everything, we realized that, number one, we did not have enough money to build a big central database where everything would be. We also thought that was not very secure, which is not. And finally, the big enemy of digital progress traditionally has been bureaucracy, but here bureaucracy came to our aid because every ministry, every agency, every part of the government that had any data, each one stored it in its own agency, own ministry. They had their own IT people. So you had the Ministry of Foreign Affairs IT people, the police IT people, social affairs IT people. And they all said, no way we're going to give up our data. So we said, ha, ha, ha. What we're going to do is we're going to have you can all keep your data, and we'll make sure you keep it well. And you can't really move it unless you do it through us. And so what we did was we created a distributed data exchange layer. What that is, well, I will explain in a short video in a moment. But there is no central database. And the only way any data can move from one server to another is through authorization, two-factor authentication, and end-to-end encryption. The way to think about it is that if you have a big centralized database, it's like this ship from about 25 years ago, the Exxon Valdez, which was a huge oil tanker that ran aground, and everything in this oil tanker, which was, I guess, the biggest oil tanker in the world at the time, ran out and destroyed the ecology of Alaska. Since then, people have gotten smarter, and what they do is, yes, you transport oil, but you keep them in compartments so that if you lose something, you don't lose everything. And that's the idea of X-Road. And I think in a minute, I will want the video to be queued up. But this is this is a static view of this, which is that you have a public internet and then all the different agencies talk to each other over the public internet, but it is always done through encryption and through the system that we have. Now, is the video ready to go? Yes? There it is. Okay. And I'll have a glass of water.
Running a modern state is a data-centered endeavor. Ensuring the functioning of the state requires administering very large quantities of data. Estonia lacks a centralized or master database. Data is stored where it is created. Each agency administers its own data separately, and data is not duplicated. At the same time, state authorities and agencies need data outside their purviews in order to function. For example, the police constantly require information from the population register. Likewise, the unemployment insurance fund depends on information from the health information system. How can authorities securely exchange important data? First, the data must be easily accessible by the authorities that are authorized to use it. Second, the integrity of the data must be maintained. No third party should be able to make any changes to the data while it is in transit. Third, the data must remain confidential during its journey. It must be protected from the eyes of unauthorized parties. The X-Road is a data exchange platform that fulfills all three of these requirements. The X-Road makes life simpler for both the state and the citizens. For example, when a child is born, information about the birth is sent directly from the hospital to the population register. From there, it is sent automatically to the health insurance fund so that the child will have health insurance and a family physician. This prevents the creation of excessive paperwork and saves time. The state functions in the background. The X-Road helps authorities make work processes more convenient. Many activities can be automated, which frees employees to deal with matters that require human involvement. Authorities also don't have to worry about the authenticity of data. They can be confident that data received from the tax board definitely originated from the actual tax board. Additionally, the X-Road can be used regardless of what technology an authority uses. For the state, the X-Road, above all, makes it possible for authorities to efficiently exchange data among themselves. Sensitive information moves securely, and the system itself is so resilient that it cannot be easily brought down by those with malicious intentions. Since the birth of X-Road in 2001, the system has operated continuously without interruption. The X-Road helps the state see the big picture of how different authorities are connected to one another. In addition, the X-Road makes it possible to exchange data not only within the country, but also across national borders. That is, of course, if databases and information systems are working properly. The biggest beneficiaries of the X-Road are, of course, the citizens. They enjoy the benefits of a better functioning state and save all of the time they would otherwise spend submitting papers and forms. How much time? During the time it took you to watch this animation, the X-Road saved around 240 working hours in Estonia. Cool.
Great. Just briefly, I mean, various countries are adopting this system that we have. I mean, we give it away. I mean, we developed it. We said, why do we need it? We give it to countries that want it. Of course, every country that wants it then has to develop it by itself. And as I mentioned, Panama has taken it over. Moldova has in Europe. The Finns have most extensively taken it over. And Mexico has adapted the system because they are a federated system, and you have many functions that are in a unitary state are at the national level in Mexico are done at the state level. The real reason why this is such an amazing advance and why it is so fast compared to the old ways of doing things is if you think about bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, since it was invented, I don't know, it was the Babylonians, the Chinese, or the Egyptians, but you would take a piece of papyrus or a clay tablet or whatever it is, and it would go to one office, and someone would look at it and check it, and then they'd it would go to the next office, and then it would go to the third office, and they would check to see if this is true and get a stamp, and then it would go on, etc., etc. That is a serial process, and bureaucracy has been a serial process or a sequential process for 5,000 years. What this does is it makes bureaucracy a parallel process. All the information goes out in all directions at once. If you want to set up a company, In the old days, you have to bring in all the members of the board, and then every board member is checked, did he pay his rent? Then it goes to the next office, did he pay his alimony? Another office, does he have any outstanding parking tickets? And it's just a sequential process. When we do it now in Estonia, if you want to set up a business, all of the queries go out automatically based on your unique identity, and the answer is, which is a yes or no answer, it comes back and says, if everything goes well, every person on the board has paid their taxes, has paid their alimony, has no outstanding crimes, has not been bankrupt, and you get your approval in 15 minutes. Parallel processing is really the key to the reduction of the bureaucracy in this system that we use. And then one of the things from the citizen point of view that everyone really likes is that once you have this system, you employ a once-only rule. And the once-only rule, which we're attempting to push through in that bureaucratic monster known as the European Union, which is that you never have to give any information to the state or the government that it already has. It is enough to identify who you are, so you don't have to keep writing your address, you don't have to keep writing the names of your children on your tax return, and so on. Now, a couple of things that you have to keep in mind also, which I mentioned in the very beginning, is you need to maintain data integrity. And this is, the more digitized you get, the more you start worrying about data integrity. Data integrity, I mean, most people talk about privacy. Can we trust this, that this information doesn't come out? Well, in our system, no, the information does not come out because every access to information is logged. So if you were to, in fact, get information that you shouldn't take and it comes out, you're caught. But what is much more important is data integrity. This will be the big issue for the future, and that is the data has changed. Think of it this way. If someone publishes my blood type or someone publishes my bank account, I probably don't like it. If someone changes the record of my blood type, that could kill me. If someone changes my bank account, well, I'm probably not very happy because most likely they're not making it bigger. And then just sort of catch up on what we've done since we instituted this system. We instituted e-voting. E-voting is something that we do just like we do all our bank transfers. It's all done exact with the same infrastructure. So if no one's lost any money in the last 17 years, we're not worried about losing votes. We do e-prescriptions, which means that you don't go around with paper anymore to get a prescription, and you can renew just by calling your doctor, and you just go pick it up with your ID. We've established a system on e-residency, which I think I'll skip, and perhaps we can talk about that later, and also data embassies, which I'll mention briefly. This is how we vote. You say, well, do I want to vote, and do I do it with an ID card or mobile, and then you log on, and then you basically say who you want to vote for. This is how we used to do prescriptions, a paper. This is how you get your drugs today. E-residency I'll come to. Data embassies is something that you need to think about if you're in a country in a seismic area, such as Peru. We don't have any seismic activity in Estonia, but in the last 1,000 years, we've been invaded on an average of twice a century. So if you get, so basically what we did was, okay, we're worried about our data all in our country. But the idea for a data embassy came from, this is a picture of the Fukushima tsunami, which was first the tsunami came, and this is what the town looked like, followed by the meltdown of the nuclear reactor. But most importantly, what happened in addition to all that tragedy was that Japan lost some of its national data, non-recoverable national data. And so we thought, well, okay, we don't have tsunamis, but we could have a neighbor tsunami invade us. And so the idea is that appealing to the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Extraterritoriality, which basically says you can't go into an embassy, is why Julian Assange is in the Ecuadorian embassy to this day, at least last I checked. And So what we do is we put a server in Luxembourg and we call it an embassy. And so no one can go in that server. It's got a dedicated line. And we have all crucial data, which is updated in real time online. So who's eligible to vote, citizens registry, taxes, who has an ID card, and so on. All these, the business registry, these are all also in parallel and always up to date in Luxembourg, which is about 2,000 kilometers away from us, and probably wouldn't be invaded at the same time we're invaded. Anyway, unfortunately, I gave this talk last week in Brazil, so, pero ahora tengo que decir muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. You talked about political will at the start of your presentation. My first question would be, who should be the champion of change? Must be the president? Could it be a political organization? Is it, do you have to assign somebody to be the champion?
Well, I mean, there are a number of factors. The bureaucratic side I'll mention second, but first of all, you need to have major stakeholders be interested in it. So that means on the government side, you need to have enough support among, I mean, in democracies. You have an authoritarian government, you can digitize automatically with no problem. But if you don't have an authoritarian government, you have a democracy with a functioning parliament, then you need to be able to count on a large enough part of the parliament that is willing to move on this. Clearly, you need the government to be very interested in doing something and take tough decisions, which there will be always. You need the private sector to be heavily interested and invested in the project. Now, in my country, and you can see where it has gone well, the private sector is very interested in developing digital identities, developing digital services. If you think about the system that we have, really is a service also to the private sector, because in fact it takes the load of secure data storage away from the company, and the government, if you think about sort of John Locke, the 18th century Enlightenment thinker about the role of government ultimately in the social contract is to provide security for the citizenry. Well, in the digital era, in the 21st century, one form of security that you are asking the government to give you is that your data is secure. Now, I mean, you can trust your, I mean, if you trust Facebook, you can do that too, but we know that you can't trust Facebook. So better to trust your government, because someone can go to jail if they abuse that trust. And then, of course, in my country, the NGO sector was very heavily involved in this, because lots of people very much wanted to move ahead with development, basically. I mean, the numbers I gave, you know, in the beginning were true. I mean, we were a very poor country. We had a long way to develop, and young people really wanted to move ahead. Okay, that's the general stakeholder issue. The other thing is how you do this bureaucratically. And again, this is just looking at across the board at where it works and where it doesn't. Where it works is where your president or your prime minister, or best of all, both, are strongly in favor of digitization, and the authority for making changes, for developing policy, lies with the president and or prime minister. It must be the primus inter pares in a government that does it. If you don't, and you do what many countries that I've seen, especially, I mean, in the European Union, there are many countries far richer than we are and are very backward compared to us. They have a minister of digital affairs. I mean, they think that's it. But the problem, if you have a Minister of Digital Affairs, if you know anything about government, is that you also have 17 other ministers say, well, that's his problem. I'm not going to deal with this. That's his problem. But if it's his problem, he comes to you, the agriculture minister, says, we really need to digitize a registry of farms. They'll say, I don't have to listen to you. Why? I mean, you're just the Minister of Digital stuff. I'm the Minister of Agriculture. And so the only way you really get things done at a whole of government way is if you have it coming from the main person, be it the prime minister, be it the president, or both. Simply saying, okay, we'll have a minister for that. It has not worked. I mean, I was trying to explain why it doesn't work, but if you look at countries where you have one minister in charge of it, if you ever talk to those people, they're always very unhappy because the rest of the government doesn't listen to them. So.
When you started working on reforms for digitalization, you also were working at the same time for economic reforms. I know they're not competing against each other. Was the digitalization reform efficiency-oriented or growth-oriented?
Well, probably more efficiency. I mean, we had horrible bureaucracy, and we wanted efficiency, and so that was the first idea. We did not know at the time, and in fact, many countries still do not know, but it was that how much more growth you get if you increase the efficiency. Also, it's not just efficiency. Transparency is something that you get when you digitize. So when I was president, everything the president's chancery spent money on was always public for people like you to go and say, why did you spend money on this? I mean,
that's what we do.
Yeah, well, I mean, if it's there to see, and sometimes it causes problems. I mean, I was president. The chancery bought a rug, and I was like, I mean, I didn't know they bought a rug, but they bought a rug, and then the newspaper says, "Why did this rug cost so much, Mr. President? Why did this rug cost so much?" I said, "What rug? I don't know." But anyway, so all of that is public. All of the official correspondence that the President's office and the Prime Minister, all the official correspondence from the government to whomever they write, or to whomever they answer, that correspondence is also all available to the public. Now, where it gets interesting is, on the transparency side, is corruption reduction. And basically, there are two broad forms of corruption. And every country has both. Some have less, but and in fact, in my country, we even have separate words. But one kind of corruption, which is the kind that usually makes the newspapers big scandals, is when someone pays a minister or a senior official to do something illegal. So give preference to one company or give preference to one person or something like that. That's illegal acts. The other kind of corruption, which is very widespread, and I read the number for Peru, is 39% of the population has encountered the second kind of corruption. And that is different because you have to pay someone to do what is legal or what he's supposed to do. So you want to get a permit to build something, you have to pay the guy, even though the guy, the official, is supposed to just give you or if you pay a fee, you're supposed to get it, but on top of the fee, you also have to pay him for whatever it is. And that kind of corruption is actually what demoralizes societies largely, because you think that you have to pay to get things, and, well, I mean, it erodes public trust. And the kind of examples, in the old days, police would take money if they stopped you for speeding, and then because if you pay the police, a small amount, you could get free. But on the other hand, if you pay the fee or the fine, it's a large sum. Well, we got rid of that fairly quickly by saying every time the police captures you speeding, there's a record of it in the central computer of the police department. So you can't say, I'll give you, I'll give you 10 euros and get me off this, because there's already a record. So, I mean, you digitize these processes. More broadly, most of the things that you get from the government as a citizen, permission to do this, permission to do that, or a tax deduction, all those things, they are yes, no binary decisions. Do you live here? Yes, you live here. Are you working at this place? Yes. Do you have 3 children? Yes. I mean, all of that, you don't need a bureaucrat to say that, well, yes, no. You have a computer that says yes, no. And if you fulfill all those binary questions, the computer says, okay, you get this tax deduction, or you get this or that, or whatever it is you're supposed to get. And that's where digitization is especially effective in corruption reduction. Now, the other kinds, kind of the higher level, well, there, it's fairly simple. You have, if you have a tender and people submit their bids for a contract, well, if you timestamp it, that already eliminates the possibility of sort of like the senior official showing some other guy, see, he's got a cheaper proposal, so, give me a new one. It's very hard to do that if all proposals are timestamped, for example. So transparency has increased dramatically, and my country is by far, very far, the least corrupt post-communist country, and in fact, we are among the better half of the countries in the European Union, which I personally think as a result of the huge transparency advances we've made.
Was there much political opposition to change?
What did I say?
They are not applauding my question. Was there?
Yeah, well, first of all, there was the first step which I started promoting was digitizing or getting computers into schools.
That didn't get much opposition, I guess.
No, it did, from this teachers union.
Oh.
And the teachers union for 1 year, the teachers union has a weekly newspaper, and basically for 1 year, every weekly issue had at least one article saying I'm an idiot, or it's a bad idea. And it's understandable, because teachers knew already instinctively that the kids, just as kids pick up languages more quickly than adults, so too getting computers was something that they would understand more easily. And then we had one party that was kind of a populist party that was, they were opposed to digital things. And they were, throughout most of the period, they were in the opposition, or they never were in the main party in the government. By the time they became the prime minister's party, digitization proceeded to the point where when the prime minister of this party that was opposed went abroad, everyone said, oh, you're from that digital country. And pretty soon you realized that the only thing that really made Estonia stand out was that it was digital, so pretty soon he was the one going around saying, well, we're the digital country, so he changed his mind.
So you did have opposition, but you were able to do political consensus behind it.
Yeah, I think that, there was broad consensus that digitization was good, and even the party that was opposed wasn't philosophically opposed, it's just they wanted to be opposed, because the government was doing it. But again, a lot of this was driven by this need to develop that I mentioned in the beginning. We had one more thing. I mentioned that Skype was invented in my country, and this was a huge factor. It was completely unplanned. There were 4 young men. They had developed a music file swapping program called Kazaa, and then they were indicted by the United States for violating intellectual property rights, and fortunately they got off going to jail. But if you think about musical files, file sharing
Voice.
or swapping is actually, it's the same thing ultimately as voice over internet protocol. It's just a static version or a non-live version. And so they invented Skype. Now, what the effect of this was that from this little corner of, up there in northeast in Europe, which is cold and rainy, and everyone thinks it's all backwards, suddenly 4 Estonians invent a worldwide brand. So suddenly people said, wow, well, maybe tech is something that's pretty cool. Or maybe, and young people after that started studying tech. Politicians started saying, well, we got this tax revenue. I mean, maybe not so bad. And so there were these external factors. So it's always good to help your tech community, sort of encourage them to do things, because they might invent the next whatever it is, and suddenly Peruvians will say, wow, we're the country of whatever it is that they invent.
Looking at the World Economic Forum Competitiveness Index, Estonia is placed on the 24th place in institutional quality. Peru is in the 116th place. How hard could it be for us to do reforms with a lack of institutional quality?
Well, you get a lot of institutional quality from actually digitizing. I make no claims about our institutional quality before. It's just that suddenly you have to be better because you have checks and balances, and when you do something wrong, it becomes public because it's all open for inspection.
But you need some prerequisites or predeterminants?
For what?
For establishing a digital revolution in terms of institutional quality.
Well, probably a little bit, yes. It is a chicken and egg thing. I mean, I won't mention it here because it's politically incorrect, but we did give our system to one country for free, as we always do, and nothing happened. Nothing happened at all, even though we actually built it for them. And the reason nothing happened was that they realized this would maybe bring too much transparency, and so they're stuck. They have it, but they don't use it. So you do need to have enough political will on top to force through the implementation of the use of these technologies. I mean, the other kind of funny example is that every year when I was president, when I went to the UN General Assembly meeting, all countries, we're a little country, we don't have many embassies, so we said, people want to meet and talk about digitization. And so I would meet with the president of a country from somewhere, and they would ask me about digitization, and I would say, well, one of the advantages of digitization is you can't bribe a computer, Until one of my staff members said, Ilva, stop saying that. I said, why? He goes, well, you're talking to the president and you're saying you can't bribe a computer, but we're looking at his staff and they're going, oh. And so you need the political will to actually implement the reforms so that you do have the transparency that you can't bribe a computer.
Just for sake of argument, the burden of government regulation in Peru is 131st place. So we're only 6 away from the last in government regulation. You mentioned advantages in corruption. How did the infrastructure of laws competed against the digitalization? Was digitalization a fast track for transparency? In what terms? I mean, it's
well, a lot of laws
obvious
become
that it is,
irrelevant
but-
because all kinds of checks that you have to do. There's more regulation than the laws. But I mean, if a law says you need to make sure that someone is someone, the regulatory side pre-digital would mean all kinds of checks, and you'd have to go all over the place. I mean, I'll tell you something. This is okay. You're bringing statistics from Peru, but I live, or my office is in the middle of Silicon Valley, and it is the mecca of IT, and in a 12-kilometer radius, I have the headquarters for Tesla, Apple, Facebook, Google, Palantir. I mean, they're all there, and all these wonderful things are there. If I want to register my car, however, with the Department of Motor Vehicles, it can take up to 3 days. You go to one window. Well, first you take a number. You go to one window, and then they do something. And then you go sit down, take another number, go to another window. Now, all of that is part of the regulations of how you register a car in the state of California. In Estonia, you just do it online, right? So in fact, you eliminate a lot of the regulatory burden of paper-based sequential bureaucracy. I mean, as I was talking before, it's serial bureaucracy. If it is, I mean, those things are taken care of, and so the regulatory side simply becomes a much lighter touch.
I'm going to ask you a question from the audience. How do you integrate information and how do you do digitalization reforms with 70% of informal activity? That's our level of informality.
Well, it becomes harder and harder to have to do work outside the system. I mean, basically, we have a carrot and stick approach all along. It's just far more efficient with digitization, which is that if you don't pay taxes, well, then you don't get services. If you don't pay, if your employer does not pay social welfare insurance for you, well, then it becomes very hard to get quality medical service. I mean, you can get emergency no matter what, but if anything more like an extended hospital stay becomes very difficult. What is hitting people now who have been working for, say, in the informal sector for many, many years, is that when they want to retire, and it turns out they have no
record.
Well, they have not paid into the Social Security system. Our Social Security system basically means you pay a certain amount and the government pays yearly or weekly or however you get paid. And so suddenly there you are, and you have not paid into the Social Security system. Where does your pension come from? You don't have a pension then. And that is, that can be fairly brutal. I mean, we all the time tell people, if you want to get a pension, then work, sort of legally.
When Estonia started the digitalization reforms, 90s, what was the informality rate? What was the size of the informal economy?
I don't know, probably 45, 50%. I don't know what it is now, but I mean, it's still there. It is clearly there. Certainly what has become much better is tax collection, which has become very digitized, and so there again, much more efficient.
So if we have to make a conclusion about how to do this, first you need a champion, obviously. You need to start as soon as possible. You have to do carrot and stick. What else should we do as a country?
Well, I would basically say work together with your banks, because that is the non-governmental stakeholder group that best understands and most needs a secure identity. Because first of all, then it makes money transfers more efficient, but also it makes things much more secure. And so everywhere I go, it's I always have, I don't know how many bankers there are here, but anyway, there are a lot of bankers when I go around the world. When I'm asked to talk about digitization, one of the drivers is the banking sector, because they realize that since banking anyway is digital, the problem is that you want it to be digital and secure, and this is one reason why the banks first. Well, in my country, the authentication, the two-factor authentication that basically says you are you. We have it's a digital center that matches your identity codes and your digital footprint to say you are you. That has been, since it was started, is a 50-50 government-bank consortium operation. So it's 50% ownership. Those are the two big stakeholders in making it a serious and secure system. And of course, what you also want is you want to get, especially young people, generally tend to be pro-digitization. They're not so young anymore. I mean, one of the things we can maybe close with this is that when we started the school program in '96, and it was fully in place by '98, '99. And then my last 2 years of being in office, I would visit startups, and because that's what presidents do. Say good guys, good work, and I would ask them, well, how did you get started? And basically 4 out of 5 times, these would now be men and women, late 20s, early 30s. They'd say to me, well, I was a child in your program, and that's how I hooked up with computers. So, educational reforms always take about 15, 20 years to have an effect, and I'm old enough to actually see it from the beginning to the end, or to it's having an effect, is that I came out with an idea that everyone said was crazy, but we did it anyway, and then 20 years later people are saying, well, I got into the whole tech business because I was a kid in your program. I think that's a pretty good thing. I personally feel pretty good about that.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation.
Agradecemos a Thomas Ilves, a Juan José Garrido e invitamos a Jaime Aguirre para la foto protocolar.